In the last video, we went over my favorite setup for my favorite pass concept in the entire game, which is 2x2 spread verticals. Not only is it great against the meta double Mable type of stuff with the stacked flat zones, but it has multiple options for any coverage that's thrown at it. And if you run the right progression of reads, you'll be sure to never miss an opening. Now, to take this a step or two further, I'll show you how to run it out of empty with 5 verticals, which combines the best out of 2x2 and the best with trips verticals all in one play. Just as a recap here, what made 2x2 4 verticals so good is this boundary comeback. And this route can really only be covered by flat zones drifting underneath it. So against stock cover 3, that comeback will always be open, but if they're doing any sort of shading or zone drop adjustments to undercut that comeback route, well then you just have a wide open seam right up here, right up the middle, and sometimes you can get 20, 30, 40 yards really easily. But the one big downside here is that the seam to the field is a little bit harder to hit, which kind of doesn't make sense, but the way it works is that he's a little bit closer inside to the offensive line here, essentially. And because he's a little bit closer, or we should say the hash rather than the offensive line, because he's a little bit closer, he's actually within the zone of recognition of these hook defenders right here. So now if the seam defender leaves the seam receiver to go cover that comeback route, say, we'll still get a free release up the seam, but that hook gets some really nice depth and it makes for a tight throw, although in some cases you can still fit it in there. Now, if you run the same idea from a 3x1 trips, which I didn't do a video on, but it's still pretty good. So we'll go ahead and do the same thing again. We're cover 3 right here. If they run it stock with no adjustments or anything, that comeback to the field will be wide open. But if they do any sort of adjustments, we can throw that field seam because that strong side hook defender right here will now not be able to cover that because he has to cover this crossing route from the tight end right here for a little bit. So right here, you see we have much more room here. We can catch that and we can turn that upfield and hopefully get a score. And that's all well and good, but with 3x1, you don't really have any good options to the other side. So what that means is that now if you have a user instead of the CPU right there, well, he can be a little bit smarter with that, right? He can go and actually cover that himself and go try to pick that off. So now to combine the best of both worlds, we just simply do it out of empty right here. So right here, we got the 2x2 to the boundary, which is really, really nice. And then we got the trips to the field, which of course, as I showed you, is really, really nice. So if the user goes to defend the field, the trips there, well, we have those 2 route combinations to the left that are really, really tough to defend, and vice versa. If you go to the left, then we got the trips to the right. So it's really a lose-lose for them. And as you'll see in this video, any of the stock zones or man matching or anything like that really struggles against all these routes. And as long as you hit your progressions in a reasonable order and a reasonable timing, you should find at least one open route for every single play. Now, of course, with empty, you do sacrifice a little bit. You have, less protection. So if they send the heat at you, you have to get it out quick, but we do have options for that. We have multiple options for that actually. And then your run game suffers a little bit because obviously you don't have a running back, but I'll touch on it a little bit at the end. This quarterback draw is really, really glitchy, really, really powerful at the beginning of the year. That was patched, but it was patched to make it not insanely overpowered, but it's actually still a really good option, particularly when your opponent's setting up everything to defend this great passing play. So now, how do we set everything up? So alignment, if it isn't obvious already, like I was saying, we want the 2 receivers into the boundary right here, or the short side of the field, and we want the trips to the field, or the wide side of the field, if you want to call it that. Then, what do we do for our route combination right here? Well, there are a couple of different things, a couple of different ways that we can run it, but for consistency and what I think will be the best across the board will just be come back to the boundary, and you will do a hook to the boundary slot receiver right here. Okay, so it's maybe you could call it 4.5 verticals, but I think it's 5 verticals because if we think about, say, match quarters, you'll have this guy matched, these 2 guys matched, and then even this guy will have to get matched. And there's ways that we can totally bork out match coverage as well. So that's what you want to do. There are a couple of adjustments that you can do if you're really sure of what you're seeing on defense. But of course, we'll get into that when it comes. So right now, we'll just go ahead and reset it, and so we can start fresh. So the progression really isn't too different than the 2x2 verticals, which is nice. So if you're already used to that, you can jump right into this and start running it really effectively. And essentially, it's just, you're reading the field towards the boundary. So in this case, we're reading right to left. Field 1, field 2, field 3, boundary 2, and boundary 1. So what we're going to do is essentially peek. Like this fade right here is essentially a peek. If it's press man and you get a super win animation and there's no defender over the top to help, you can just stare in on that, lob it over the top, and get your big play. In some cases where they're playing off, I might change this to a comeback route, but in most cases, especially against good players, they're going to be pressing. So we want to be sure that every play, if they mess anything up, if they're running aggressive and they get beat, or if they mess any of their coverages, their coverage assignments up, we can hit them over the top. But that's, a really quick alert, a really quick peek. We're going to know right away if that's available, because we're going to get used to those win animations against press man, and we're going to get used to those cover 2 chuck animations, so we know right away. If that corner bails and we know we're not going to win, then we just go to our next progression, which is the seam. If the seam is open, we're going to hit it. If not, we're going to run to the crosser here, and then I would say curl to come back, but by the time you get to this side, it'll be really obvious which one's open. So you're actually kind of reading these two at the same time. But just to keep it simple, it's just, field 1 by 1 all the way to the boundary. And so in this case, it's right to left. But if the field was to the left, it'd be left to right. You would just flip it. That's really, really important. These two guys need to be right here to the boundary. Otherwise, it's still good, but it's not as dominant, I'd say. And then the setup itself, so just like this. Again, there might be a few variations, but it's really just this. And then, let's get into it against this double Mable look. Okay, so again, and unfortunately in next gen, we don't have coaching adjustments in practice mode, so you kind of just have to take my word for it that this stuff works. But, luckily we're not trying to hit any big corner routes or big crossers all the way across the field and the sidelines. So anything that they do in terms of setting really deep zone drops or really shallow zones underneath them, we don't really care. And it works better for us because all of our routes are hitting the spots that are vacated by these zone drops. Even the comeback routes will get open against this. But anyway, you have something like this, the double flats, the cover 3 shell over the top, one zone defender in the middle, and then, they'll probably have a spy as well. And what's great about this is that they only have 2 rushers, so we have all the time in the pocket. But what's great about this play, although we're hitting deep, right? It's vertical. We don't have to wait for any crossers or any long developing routes. It's all the way up the field immediately, and just by that, let alone the fact that we're coming up against this weak pass rush, we don't need to worry too much because we're getting the ball out quick. Anyway, so in this case, I'm not going to think too much about the user. I'll just kind of show you how things go right here. Again, we're going to be peeking right here. If it's open, we'll take it. In this case, it won't be because the guy's going to bail. But we'll have this seam right up here, and we can throw that for an easy 20 yards. And in that case, I threw that with a bit of an outside pass lead. You'll get used to it. You'll know which one's appropriate for the situation. In this case, it's actually a little bit tough because the middle third is already set to the trips, so you don't have that much spacing there. But if you throw it right, you can get your 15-20 yards. Then we can pretend we're in a situation where your opponent tries to use it at themselves. If they really hard commit over there, well, then we have the crosshair free in the middle of the field, obviously, really easy stuff. Or if they're a really good user, let's go like this, and let's say that they're splitting these guys. It's kind of hard. You don't really trust, he might try to bait you there and then come back quickly to undercut the crosser, and you really just don't want to deal with that. But then you can see that he's going there, and then you have these options right here. You have this little hook right here, and you just turn that upfield, again, for 15, 20 easy yards. Now, in this case, it's if we're sure that we're coming up across this situation where all these flat routes and we just have one user in the middle of the field and the middle third is all the way to the right, we can convert this guy if we want to just a vertical right here. I try not to predict too much. I want to just have one static for setup that I know will be good against anything that's thrown against me. But if we for sure know that they're doing this and we want to make this a little bit better, we can convert this to a seam right here so we can get more yards out of it. But by and large, I don't think it's necessary. I think the curl does a good job on its own. And in fact, if they do something that really messes with you and they drop another guy to cover this curl right here, I mean, the man, as you'll see, man coverage actually doesn't cover the curl. But if somehow they're able to do some really wild stuff, this comeback actually gets open. And I can't show it here because, again, we don't have the coaching adjustments, but it gets open between those 25 and 5 yard stacked flat zones. You just have to wait a little bit for that comeback to come back. You can't throw it early like I do normally. But he's going to be there for a nice, easy 10 to 15 yards. So almost every route here, except for this guy to the field, will be open against this. At one point or another. I mean, of course, if a user takes the seam, then that takes away one other one, but we have all these other options. So that's the meta double Mable stuff, and let's go right ahead to some of the more conventional coverages. Okay, let's head next to just regular old cover 3 right here. 4 down cover 3, and it's just stock, no adjustments right here, and all it is just like this. Now, if it's obviously cover 3 and they're playing off like this, again, I might even just come back the field guy just so I have multiple options. But again, just want to keep it consistent because sometimes you might have guys playing press, and then you want to make sure that you have an option over the top if it comes about. So in this case, what I'm looking at, which side is the user? So is the user over here on the trips? Well, I don't really want to play with him anyway, so I'm just going to look over here to the boundary right here. And if they're doing any sort of shading or any sort of zone adjustments, this curl route right here will be wide open for at the bare minimum 10 yards, but you can sometimes take that upfield. Against stock cover 3, where you get the stock curl flat animation where they chuck that seam receiver, because he does that, this comeback is going to be wide open down the sidelines right here for 15, 20 yards. And then like I showed you with the 1x3 trips verticals, we do have some options to the trip side as well. So if our user's over here, and we don't want to risk anything with this curl route over here, then we have a couple of options over to the right. So we of course have the seam if they do any sort of zone adjustments, big 30-yard gain right there. Or let's say if they are running their zone adjustments so that this guy can drive underneath the comeback and maybe they man up this guy right here and the user's over here on the curl, well then, you can hit this crosser early right here, right up the field, one-on-one with the free safety, try to truck him with the tight end, but you see there's so many options. Now, if you really want to have all your basics covered, this is a lot of hot routes right here, but you can do the same thing to the right side where you curl the slot guy and you come back the guy to the right. So now in this case, if they are running stock cover 3 and they're bringing this guy over here and you don't want to play around with him, you have that field comeback route as well, and you can hit that. But again, only do that if you're really, really sure it's cover 3. In this case, if it's single high, I definitely recommend doing that. But otherwise, if it's something you don't really know what it is, it's too high, it's press, this simple setup right here will be great against 95, 98% of things thrown at you. Now, let's move on to cover 2. So cover 2, again, this is one of the main reasons why I'm reading this field fade first. So if I see that cover 2 chuck, let me just get off him right there and get on the D line. If I see that cover 2 chuck, I'm zoning in on him. I'm going to wait for him to clear that cloud flat, and I'm just going to throw it down the sideline there for my nice 40 yards. So against cover 2, in most cases, that's all you're going to need. But if they're doing something weird, like they're really backing him off, and you're not able to throw that there, or they're running some really deep zone adjustments on their cloud flats, like 30 yards or so, well, then you can go to your next read right here. So now, these two guys get open nicely. Usually, I think for cover 2, the user is going to drift towards these guys. But if they're on the D line or if they're way over here, then you can play this game right here. So you have the seam. It might not be something you want to wait for But if you have a little bit of time in the pocket and they're not running that deep middle third, it'll be there. But if they are, so say again, for whatever reason, say if the corner's backed off right here, and you don't get that chuck that you can leverage off of, you can go to your next read. But if they have a middle third right here and the user's over here on the curl, which they might be, that's something I'll show you in a bit, and you don't want to throw that seam, well, again, you can be a little bit patient right here and you can throw that crosser right there in that sweet spot on the numbers. And you'll notice for that crosser, really, if it's zone, you'll be throwing it in this kind of area here, whether it's cover 3 or cover 2. If it's zone, you'll be throwing it before the numbers. It's not one of those crossing routes that you want to wait all the way to the sideline, except if it's man, or some instances man match, you'll wait a little bit longer for it to go to the sideline, just so you can get a little bit more separation. But just be wary that the user can always come off and try to undercut that crosser. It's there. It's a nice option, but it is very in the middle of the field in the user's territory. So it usually isn't as ideal as I'm showing it here. But again, I think in a lot of cases you don't even need to throw to him, because these other other 4 routes are just so good. Anyway, back to cover 2. So we have, this can be a good option down the sideline. This can be a good option splitting the safeties. And this can be a good option underneath that middle third runner. And I will actually need to reset this because my other slot defender is out of position. I want to make sure that it's fair. Okay, back to cover 2 right here. Now, what's really cool is that this curl route actually gets underneath vertical hooks, whether they're doing shading underneath or over the top. He actually does a good job of just setting right underneath the vertical hook, and you can throw that there. You don't even need to do a low ball, and you can get at the bare minimum 10 yards. And then, believe it or not, but if it's a stock cloud flat or if it's a really deep cloud flat, this comeback route can actually get open. So you just need to wait a little bit in the pocket right here and then just throw a low ball and come back to it manually with your receiver. Now this particular version of empty, for whatever reason, this comeback doesn't come back as sharp. He kind of just turns around and sits. There are a few, I don't know where they are, what they are, how to get them to work, but there are few that the comeback comes back deeper, and so you can actually hit this even better against cloud flats. But even this, if you throw it with the low ball and if you come back manually, you can actually throw that against cloud flats, which is nice. So that's cover 3 Mable, double Mable meta stuff, and cover 2. For both of those, for all of those, you have at least 4 routes open. Against cover 2, you saw 5 possible routes open too, which is awesome to have, particularly with the user usually taking away 1 or 2 of those. Okay, so now let's jump to cover 4 quarters. So cover 4, actually quarter 4 drop I won't really go into here, but it's pretty much the same deal as cover 3. You're going to be looking at the comeback if it's stock. If they're doing any sort of shading, the curl route would be open. The seam is open if you throw it early against cover 4 drop. Or again, you can do this setup right here where you have double comebacks and double curls. But let me go ahead and reset this. So again, stock quarters right here, this side really doesn't have much going for it. You can see right away, this guy will be capped, this guy and this guy. But we do have the comeback to the boundary here. Throw that a little bit early. We get a nice chunk of yards. And again, just like cover 3, if they are trying to take away those comeback routes by doing any sort of shading underneath, all that means is now they have nobody in that seam area. We can just go ahead and throw this curl. And again, if they're playing something like this where it's just off coverage, stock quarters, and they're not doing any sort of pressing, we can, again, do the same thing to the other side right here. So let's say for whatever reason, they do a 3-down type of thing and they try to user this side to take that away. Well, then we can go to this side right here, throw the field comeback, or likewise, we can throw the field curl as well. So if they shade underneath that comeback, that just means that there's nobody right here, and we can throw that for our 11 or 12 yards. So yeah, for match quarters, really it's mostly about the outside comebacks. And then if they are doing any sort of shading, you got the curls up the seams. Or if you want to take a shot, like say if they're doing cover 4 quarters and they're shading to take away the comebacks, you don't even need to necessarily concern yourself with with these guys because you also have this crosser that gets open over the top. And the reason why that happens is because, again, you have 5 verticals right here, right? The corner's taken, the safety's taken, the corner's taken, the safety's taken. Actually, in this case, we could have taken the seam right up the middle right there. But if you would have stayed with the seam, we would have had the crosser right over the top. Of course, unless the user takes him, which is definitely a possibility. And then in palms, actually, I think in palms it would work out the same right here. Because the nickel guy would have to take the seam, and if he's doing any sort of shading, he's just going to let him all the way up the field. So really, against quarters or palms, you're looking away those comebacks, and the only way they can take those comebacks away is with the underneath guys, and if they don't have those guys, they don't have enough guys to cover over the top, which is nice. Okay, now let's end this off with some man coverage right here. So we'll do 2-man, and then we'll move on to cover 0. So same thing over here, and what I'll actually do, it's pretty obvious within a split second that it's going to be press man coverage. So if your guy doesn't win over here on the fade, or if there's safety help over the top, I'll actually just go ahead and skip these 2 guys right here. In some cases, the crosser can get open, but I don't really like relying on it. These 2 routes will get open. So I'll go ahead and peek at the fade. If it doesn't work out, I'll go right to the curl right here. That was a running back, and he was still able to get open. But yeah, ideally you're running this out of like 10 personnel or even 0 personnel if you're in run and shoot, where you have a receiver here instead of a running back. So he can do a little bit better job against press man. But even in this case, it's a running back. I'm able to get it in there. But if I don't want to mess around with him, I also have the comeback right here, which sometimes gets off its route a little bit. He sometimes turns a little bit too early. So you have to anticipate that a little bit, but once you're good at it, you're good at it, and you just can't be covered. In other cases, he'll turn a little bit later, you just throw it early, and you have that nice big chunk of yards. And if it is man coverage, like obviously right here, the left side is so much better because you have 2 man beaters right here. And of course, if your user is on this weak safety and he's coming down and muddying that up a little bit, well, you can just do this adjustment right here again, where you have the curl and come back to the field and simply just work that side of the ball as well. So that's cover 2 man. It's mostly just about hitting those curls and comebacks, which for at least next gen, it looks like a really, really good way of attacking man coverage. And if it's a soft press or just off man coverage, they get open even better. Now let's end this off with cover 0. So cover 0, obviously we don't have enough guys to protect right here. They're sending 6 and we only have 5. But what's great about this is that it really makes cover 0 obvious. Like right here, it's really obvious that it's cover 0 because we have 2 safeties right over here. And even if they press. So now, if they call it cover 0, what do? So either they user one of these guys, and then it's 5 against 5 in the protection, or they insert themselves on the blitz. Or they pick one of these guys and they have to cover him man on man. They can't really do any freelancing or anything like that. So we can just do the same thing right here. In this case, it's obviously cover 0. So what I'll do is I'll leave this hook right here. And what's great about that, he doesn't get pressed. And you can just, before the pressure even comes in, you can go ahead and throw that. And usually you can turn that up the field, make one guy miss, and you're in there for a score. So obviously, cover 0 has its benefits with the quick pressure, but if it doesn't come in and you get that ball off quick and you make that one guy miss, it's going to be 6. Okay, so back to cover 0. So obviously, I saw cover 0, so I did the adjustment to the field. You can also peek at this guy. He has a chance to win, and obviously there's no safety help over the top. If you win there, it's a touchdown also. If your opponent is usering one of these guys, you can also hit the crosser really quick as soon as he crosses the safety's face, if you want to throw that. Or, again, I don't think you should be too afraid of these hard press animations. So even though they're pressed on the left over right here, and even if we have a pretty bad matchup with the running back, we just need to wait a little bit of a split second and we can throw that, make a guy miss, make 2 guys miss. That time not for 6, but we still got a nice chunk. And lastly, if we have a little bit of confidence in ourselves and we can wait, with that pressure right up in our face, that comeback usually has enough time to win. So the pressure's coming in hot, but if we throw it before the break, we can also throw that comeback But again, you're basing this off of kind of what the user is doing. If he's to the left, even if it's, cover 0 and they can't do too much freelancing, they can still do some crazy wild things trying to throw you off your game just in time for the pressure to come in. So sometimes it's just better off pick one side or the other. But as you see here, just like against zone coverage or match coverage or two-man coverage, you have at least 4 different options to throw on every single play. You just need to be smart with your progressions. You don't need to decipher the defense too much. I mean, obviously, if it's cover 0, you might do a little bit. Or if it's off coverage, you might change it up a little bit over here. But for the most part, I think it's pretty simple. And I think it's really, really effective. Now, back to what I was saying at the beginning of the video. Obviously, it's not super great against... so pressure, you don't have the guys to block, but like I just showed you against cover 0, we can get the ball out quick into the hands of our playmakers. And then we don't have a running back, but this quarterback draw play is still pretty good. So right here, cover 3 is pretty good run defense against this. But it's still a pretty good option right here. So this is probably the worst case. So obviously not the best situation right here. Cover 3, good run defense here. And then plus you're running with Aaron Rodgers, which obviously isn't the type of quarterback you want to be running this with. But if you're in MUT, you have some quick guys. But you can play around with like double teaming guys. This will allow you to get some cool lead blocking out of those guys, and you can pick up big chunks of yards even with your slowest quarterbacks. I find this one works for whatever reason. If we double team the guy in the A gap right here, for whatever reason, the guard is able to come off of him and give you a nice lead blocker right here, and then you're just one-on-one with the free safety. So not only are you great up against any sort of pass defense that comes against you, you actually have a possibility with the run game as well. Anyway, that's it with this, showing you the superiority of 4 verticals, and in this case actually 5 verticals, or 4.5 verticals if you want to call it that. I think it's going to be great for you right now, and I think it's going to be especially great for you when Madden 22 comes out and people are still getting their bearings on defense. You're going to come out the gates flying, scoring a ton of points. Anyway, so that's it for this one. I hope you guys liked it, and we'll see you guys in the next one.